Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving straight into one of the most intensely debated historical topics out there, the age of Aisha at the time of her marriage. If you've spent, any time at all looking into interfaith debates, you already know that this single number, specifically the claim that she was 9 years old, is literally at the center of the conversation. And honestly, it's become an obsession for some critics, particularly in certain Christian apologetics. But today, we aren't taking sides. We're going to rigorously look at the source material, the actual chronological math that strongly suggests she wasn't 9 at all, and comparative theological texts to understand exactly where this number comes from and why it gets weaponized so often.
Here's our roadmap for today. We'll be covering the historical number problem, the single force dependency, doing the chronological math, the traditionalist defense, the fallacy of presentism, and finally, history on its own terms. Let's get right into it. Before we even touch the numbers, we have to ask ourselves, how do we actually verify events that went down over 1,400 years ago? When modern debaters argue about Aisha's age, they almost always assume that ancient societies kept these meticulous, highly accurate birth certificates like we do today. But, well, they didn't. Early Arabian society just didn't have centralized birth records. Age was usually estimated or calculated starting from puberty, not from the day someone was born. So nailing down a historical fact, it's like putting together a giant puzzle.
Section 1. The historical number problem.
To really grasp the argument against the traditional age, we need to talk about isnad. Hadith literature, which records the sayings and traditions of the Prophet Muhammad, was initially an oral chain of transmission. It was compiled roughly 200 years after the actual events. So we're not talking about a contemporaneous historical diary here. And because it was passed down by word of mouth, it was naturally susceptible to human error, memory lapses, and even geographical variations as people moved around.
Moving on to Section 2, the single source dependency.
This is where we see a huge split in historical methodology. In Islamic scholarship, the absolute strongest historical events are what's called mutawatir, meaning they're mass transmitted by tons of independent sources. But here's the kicker. The claim that Aisha was 9, it originates almost entirely from a solitary family chain, passing through just one narrator named Hisham ibn Urwa. Hadith critics are quick to point out that relying on a single chain makes a historical report highly vulnerable to anomalies. And that actually brings us to the number 71. That's the approximate age when Hisham relocated from Medina to Iraq. Now, why does that matter? Well, classical scholars, including Imam Malik himself, noted that Hisham's memory seriously declined during this later Iraqi period. And the fascinating part? Literally all the narrations stating Aisha was 9 originate from this later period in Iraq, not from his earlier, much more reliable time in Medina. Think about it. If the Prophet had married a 9-year-old, the people of Medina where the marriage actually happened would have definitely known. Yet, early Medinan scholars don't report this at all.
Which leads us to Section 3, doing the chronological math.
When you map out the major events of the era, the traditional timeline basically falls apart. If you follow the age 9 theory, Aisha would have been born in 614 CE. But historical records list her as an early convert to Islam right after the revelations began in 610 CE. How could she convert 4 years before she was born? Furthermore, there's a highly authentic narration where Aisha says she was a young girl playing with toys when Surah Al-Qamar was revealed in 613 CE. Again, if she was born in 614, she wouldn't have even existed yet, let alone been old enough to be running around playing. This is where we find arguably the strongest evidence that she was not 9. We know, as a mass-transmitted, verifiable historical fact, that Aisha's older sister, Asma, died in the year 73 AH, at exactly 100 years old. So, if we do the math backward, Asma was 27 at the time of the Hijra, the migration to Medina in 622 CE. Historical consensus strictly agrees Aisha was exactly 10 years younger than her sister. Do the math, and Aisha would have been 17 at the Hijra. That makes her 18 at the time her marriage was consummated. 18, not 9.
And the language backs this up too. When Aisha was first suggested for marriage, the classical Arabic term used to describe her was bikran. Now, this specific word strictly implies a mature young woman of marriageable age who has reached puberty. If they were talking about a 6 or 7-year-old child at the time of the proposal, they would have used completely different Arabic terms, like sagira. The vocabulary used just doesn't match a young child.
So we're looking at a pretty clear split in methodology here. On one side, we have a chronological reevaluation proving she was around 17 or 18 based on mass-transmitted timelines, which suggests that single-source hadith is simply an error. But on the other side, we have traditionalist scholars who accept that single-source text because it's part of canonical collections.
Instead of rejecting the text, they choose to explain it through the lens of 7th century norms. Let's look into that in Section 4, the traditionalist defense. Traditionalist scholars always start by clarifying a really crucial point. This specific detail is entirely historical. It is not a matter of core creed or akida. It's nowhere in the Quran. Yet in modern interfaith debates, certain Christian apologists obsess over this number, disproportionately weaponizing it to attack the faith. Traditionalists argue this is just a massive distraction from actual, meaningful theological discussions. To defend the text, these scholars point to the sheer, harsh reality of the 7th century world. They remind us that in a society with a life expectancy of maybe 30 years, waiting until modern ages like 25 or 30 to marry was just, well, literally impossible if you wanted your society to survive. Plus, like we mentioned, no centralized birth records meant age wasn't tied to a specific birth year. Custom dictated that once a young woman showed physical and mental readiness, she was eligible for marriage.
Which brings us directly into Section 5, the fallacy of presentism.
You see, traditionalist scholars rightfully point out that applying modern 21st century standards, like high school graduation ages, to 7th century desert Arabia is a massive logical fallacy. It's called presentism. You just cannot take the legal codes and social norms of a modern industrialized nation and copy-paste them onto a 1400-year-old agrarian society. It doesn't work.
And here is where the argument really heats up. When interfaith debaters hyperfixate on Aisha's alleged age, traditionalists call out what they see as a glaring hypocrisy. These critics apply the fallacy of presentism exclusively to Islamic texts. Meanwhile, they completely gloss over the identical, totally well-documented marriage norms found throughout their own Christian and Jewish historical literature. It's a huge double standard.
To really grasp this, we have to level the playing field. Look at the 6th century Byzantine history of Joseph, early Christian literature. It records the Virgin Mary as being 12 years old when she married a 90-year-old Saint Joseph. Or take Jewish literature. The renowned biblical commentator Rashi, commenting on Genesis, records that Rebekah was legally married to Isaac at the age of 3. 3 years old. So traditionalists are basically asking, if you aren't going to call revered biblical figures predators based on ancient norms, why is that standard only applied to Islam?
And we aren't even just talking about ancient theologies here. Fast forward hundreds of years to Western royalty, and you see the exact same thing. Alfonso II of Aragon married Eleanor of Castile when she was just 9. Henry of England, he was engaged to Margaret of France when she was 2 and married her at 13. These young engagements and marriages were entirely consistent with global historical norms across the board. Honestly, you don't even have to go back to the Middle Ages. Surprisingly, as recently as 1885, historical records show that the legal age of consent in the state of Delaware, right here in the U.S., was just 7 years old. The majority of states at that time set the age at 10. That completely shatters the idea that we can judge ancient societies by today's standards, because today's standards are a very, very recent invention. This all brings us to our final section. History on its own terms. So we are left with 2 very rigorous, very compelling ways to process our source material. Method A is the revisionist approach. It looks at the undeniable chronological math, like Ozma's age, and concludes that the traditional timeline is just mathematically flawed, proving Aisha was actually 17 or 18. Method B is the contextualist approach. It accepts the traditional texts, but demands historical empathy, shutting down modern hypocrisy by showing that, even if she was 9, it was a universal norm found in Christian, Jewish, and secular histories alike, and absolutely shouldn't be judged by presentism. Ultimately, this explainer leaves us with a fascinating challenge. When we're faced with these intense historical controversies, especially ones weaponized in modern debates, how do we respond? Do we honor the past by interrogating its texts to correct our timelines, or do we expand our empathy to understand its forgotten norms? Thank you so much for exploring this source material with me today. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you